More than a headline, why consent matters in true crime. Imagine turning on your streaming service and seeing a dramatized version of your family's most traumatic loss, told for entertainment purposes, but never once asked if you ever wanted your story shared in such a manner. This is what happens too often to victims' families whose loved one's death or victimization has been used as an inspiration for a true crime documentary. And it's not a rare, isolated situation. It's a pattern that repeats itself every time a true crime series climbs the streaming charts. As an LPN who has cared for patients and families during some of their most difficult moments, I understand deeply that a person's story belongs to them. Why audience should care about supporting rights to control and maintain ownership over their family members' experiences. Today I'm going to show you how true crime media affects victims' families without first receiving their consent, why current laws do not provide adequate protection to victims' families, how the true crime media industry can and should take steps to better protect the rights of victims' families. To understand why this issue matters so much, let's start with the harm it's already causing. True media uses victim stories for entertainment purposes without the family's consent or permission. This creates real psychological and emotional harm to co-victims, the surviving family members left to live with a story that is no longer fully their own. Co-victims repeatedly report a total loss of privacy and a loss of control over how they'd like their story about their loved ones told and edited. According to the research from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, co-victims interviewed by Boyd and Slackoff found that inaccuracy, sensationalism, loss of privacy, and lack of control over editing were their major complaints regarding true crime media coverage. That loss of control has caused families to be re-traumatized and has lengthened their grieving process. Trauma therapist Jesse Budafugo stated that grieving processes may last longer if a tragic event is publicly exposed before the survivor has a say in what happens to their own story. Beyond the media itself, families also face harassment from true crime enthusiasts, sometimes called citizen sleuths, who believe they have a right to investigate and comment on the cases themselves. According to the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communication, true crime's rise of citizen sleuths has led some online followers to name innocent people close to the victim as suspects and direct harassment at someone who is still grieving. So the harm isn't limited to the documentary itself. It's spread outwards into the comment sections, into DMs, into the daily life of someone who is already suffering. Now that we've seen how much of an impact exploitation has emotionally as well as psychologically for families, it's time to ask ourselves, how can we allow this to occur repeatedly? Exploitation continues because there's no consistent legal or ethical standard requiring consent from family members of victims right now. And that's the part that surprised me the most researching this topic. We assume that there must be some law protecting families in this situation, but there isn't. That's an issue. There's an issue with current privacy legislation because it generally favors the First Amendment rights of content producers rather than giving victims' families any control over their deceased loved one's story. The University of Miami Law Review points out that most times victim families have limited success in protecting their rights because most courts give content providers First Amendment rights precedence over privacy claims. As legal scholar Caitlin McNulty explains, victims and their families have no grounds to prevent the production of their stories, with courts often ruling against victims or their families in cases against entertainment companies. Again, the First Amendment protects companies from producing these stories if a story is found in public records and portrayed accurately, factually, and respectfully. In other words, if it's technically true and technically legal, families are left with almost no say. Even when families are harmed by a documentary, there can be no legal action taken against companies unless the documentary has defamed them. Legal cheek references the backlash caused by Netflix Dahmer series. Currently, there is no federal law protecting against privacy violations or emotional suffering resulting from content. However, there are laws protecting against defamation. Without some form of industry standard regulation, it will depend completely on the producer as to whether they respect the wishes of the families who may be impacted by a documentary. A study in the Law, History, and Society Journal identifies this lack of enforceable standards within the true crime documentary genre as being one of the largest ethical gaps. Current law offers little protection to families, so the responsibility rests with the industry to fill this gap. And many producers are already providing examples of what this can look like. True crime content producers, along with all media platforms, utilize victims' accounts for profit and need to adhere to specific standards concerning obtaining family members' consent prior to making money off a victim's story. The good news is we don't have to imagine what this looks like. Some creators are already doing it. Some true crime producers are already creating new models by putting the victim's family members at the forefront of their process. Cold Case Inc. points out that true crime podcasters such as Criminal and Case File have created what's called a victim-first consent policy, an approach that's become known as dignity storytelling. Audience members have been calling for these changes for quite some time now, which is a clear call to action for content creators. According to a 2024 YouGov poll cited by Psychology Today, nearly 64% of Americans believe true crime creators should obtain family consent before telling stories of victims. This isn't a fringe option. It's close to 2/3 of the country. The audience is already asking for this. The industry just has to listen. Formalizing consent as a standard industry practice rather than leaving it to individual choice would give families the protection that current law does not. The Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics already establishes minimizing harm as a core principle, showing that formal industry standards for protecting subjects already exist and could specifically require obtaining consent from victims' families. We're not asking the industry to invent something new. We're asking it to actually hold itself to the standard it already claims to have. As we've seen, this is an issue with real consequences, but the solution is already within reach. Today, I've explained how true crime media causes lasting psychological suffering to families of victims, how current laws leave those families with very little protection. I explained that creators can close this gap by adopting clear standards of consent, and some creators are already doing this. Next time you press play on a documentary about true crime, remember, behind every file, there is still a family living with the aftermath.